The auction block stood in the blazing afternoon sun of Bentonville, Arkansas, and Florence Hartley knew her life was about to change forever as the auctioneer called her name with all the compassion of a man selling livestock. It was June 1878, and the crowd of rough miners, ranchers, and merchants gathered around the wooden platform with hungry eyes that made her stomach turn, their whispers carrying on the hot wind like vultures circling prey. Her father had gambled away everything they owned, and then some, leaving debts so massive that the creditors had seized not just their small farm, but demanded she be sold to the highest bidder to settle what remained. The humiliation burned hotter than the sun beating down on her dark blonde hair, and she kept her chin up despite the tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. $20, called out a tobacco-stained merchant who owned the general store, his grin revealing missing teeth. 30, countered a rancher known for working his hired hands near to death. Florence closed her eyes, praying for mercy from a God who seemed to have abandoned her family years ago. Her father sat in the town jail, too ashamed to even watch what his weakness had wrought. Her mother had died 3 winters past from fever, and now Florence stood alone, 19 years old and being sold like a piece of property. The auctioneer's voice droned on, detailing her qualities as though she were a horse, mentioning her ability to cook, clean, and work a farm. $50, came a new voice, deep and rough as gravel. The crowd parted slightly, and Florence opened her eyes to see a mountain of a man pushing through. He stood well over 6 feet tall with shoulders so broad they blocked out the sun, muscles straining against a worn buckskin shirt that had seen better days. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, wild and untamed, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his weathered face. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, pale blue like a winter sky, and they looked directly at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Everything about him spoke of the wilderness, of long months spent in the mountains far from civilization, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down bears and lived to tell the tale. 60, the rancher spat, annoyed at the interruption. $100, the mountain man said, his voice carrying across the square with absolute finality. The crowd went silent. $100 was a fortune, more than most men in Bentonville saw in half a year. The auctioneer blinked in surprise, his gavel hovering in mid-air. The mountain man reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a mix of coins and folded bills, the sum total of what looked like years of trapping and trading furs in the high country. $100, the auctioneer repeated, his voice rising with excitement at the unexpected windfall. Do I hear 110? $110, the crowd remained silent. No one was fool enough to bid against a mountain man who looked like he could break a man in half with his bare hands, and certainly not for that kind of money. The auctioneer waited the customary time, then brought his gavel down with a sharp crack. Sold, to the gentleman for $100. Florence felt her knees go weak. The mountain man moved toward the platform with surprising grace for someone so large, counting out his money to the creditor's representative, who had organized this whole degrading affair. Every coin and bill he handed over represented months of hard, dangerous work in the mountains, and he was giving it all away for her. She did not understand why, could not fathom what would make a stranger spend his entire fortune on a woman he had never met. The creditor's man counted the money twice, nodded with satisfaction, and gestured for Florence to step down. Her legs felt like they might give out, but she managed to descend the 3 steps without falling. The mountain man stood waiting, and up close he was even more imposing. His arms were thick as tree trunks, his hands large and calloused from hard labor, and old scars marked his knuckles and forearms. He smelled of pine, wood smoke, and leather, the scent of the wilderness clinging to him like a second skin. "Come on," he said quietly, and started walking toward the edge of town where a massive horse waited, a sturdy bay that looked strong enough to carry 2 people and supplies into the mountains. Florence followed because she had no choice, her worn dress dusty from the road, her few possessions already confiscated and sold off. The crowd parted for them, men stepping aside with wary respect for the mountain man, women whispering behind their hands about what might happen to poor Florence Hartley. She heard the speculation, the assumptions that she would be used and discarded, and fresh shame colored her cheeks. When they reached his horse, the mountain man finally turned to face her fully. His pale blue eyes studied her face, and she forced herself to meet his gaze despite her fear. "My name is Ezra Yancey," he said. "I live up in the mountains about 3 days' ride from here. I come down twice a year to trade furs and get supplies." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his fierce appearance. "I heard about what your father did about the auction. No woman should be sold like that, treated like property. It is not right." Florence swallowed hard. "Then why did you buy me?" "Because if I did not, someone else would have." Ezra reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the bill of sale the creditor's man had just given him. Without ceremony, he tore it in half, then in half again, letting the pieces fall to the dusty ground. "You are free. I do not own you, and I never will. You can go wherever you want, do whatever you want." She stared at the torn paper drifting in the breeze, her mind struggling to comprehend his words. "I do not understand. You spent everything you had." "I will earn more." He said it simply, as though throwing away a fortune meant nothing. "I know a family in town, the Mitchells. They run a boarding house and are good people. I can take you there, help you get settled. Or if you have family elsewhere, I can give you money for a stage ticket." "I have no one." The words came out barely above a whisper. "My mother is dead, my father is in jail, and I have no other kin. I have nothing and no way to pay for lodging." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Then I will take you to the Mitchells and pay for a month's room and board. That will give you time to find work, maybe at one of the shops in town or helping at the boarding house. Mrs. Mitchell is always looking for help with the cleaning and cooking." It was more kindness than Florence had expected from anyone, let alone a complete stranger. Tears finally spilled down her cheeks, and she wiped at them angrily, hating that she was crying in front of this man who had just given everything to set her free. "Why?" she asked again, needing to understand. "Why would you do this for someone you do not even know?" His jaw tightened beneath his beard, and he looked away toward the mountains rising in the distance. "I had a sister once. She was sold to pay my father's debts when I was 15. I tried to stop it, but I was just a boy with no money and no power. The man who bought her was cruel. She did not last a year before the hard work and his fists killed her." His voice remained steady, but Florence could hear the old pain buried deep beneath the words. "I swore then that if I ever had the chance to save someone from that fate, I would. Today, I had that chance." Florence felt her heart break for him, for the boy who had lost his sister, for the man who carried that guilt into adulthood. "I am sorry. Do not be sorry, just live a good life. That is all I ask." He gestured to his horse. "Come on. I will take you to the boarding house before the shops close for the evening. You will need proper clothes and supplies if you are going to find work." She hesitated, looking down at her worn dress and scuffed boots. "I cannot pay for new clothes. I still have a little money left from my last trading trip, kept separate from my main funds. Enough for basics." He swung up onto his horse with easy strength, then extended his hand down to her. "It is the least I can do." Florence took his hand, feeling the rough calluses against her palm, and he lifted her up behind him as though she weighed nothing at all. She had to wrap her arms around his waist to keep her balance, and she could feel the solid muscle beneath his buckskin shirt. The horse started forward at a steady walk, carrying them through the dusty streets of Bentonville toward the more respectable part of town, where the boarding houses and churches stood. They rode in silence for a while, Florence acutely aware of how close she sat to this stranger, who had shown her more kindness than anyone in her life. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden buildings and dirt roads, and the sounds of the town surrounded them. Hammering from the blacksmith shop, laughter from a saloon, the rattle of wagon wheels on packed earth. "Your sister," Florence said softly. "What was her name?" "Emma." The single word carried a wealth of memory. She was 17, full of life and dreams. She wanted to be a teacher, had a gift for letters and numbers. Instead, she died scrubbing floors and taking beatings from a man who saw her as less than human. "Emma would be proud of what you did today." Ezra did not respond, but his shoulders relaxed slightly, and Florence thought perhaps her words had brought him some small comfort. They reached the boarding house as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The Mitchell house was a large two-story building with a wide porch and flower boxes in the windows, maintained with obvious care and pride. Mrs. Mitchell herself answered the door, a sturdy woman in her 50s with kind eyes and flour on her apron. Her face lit up when she saw Ezra. "Ezra Yancey. I did not expect to see you until fall. Come in, come in." Then her gaze shifted to Florence, and her expression became curious but welcoming. "And who is this?" "This is Florence Hartley," Ezra said, helping Florence down from the horse before dismounting himself. "She needs a room and is looking for work. I can pay for a month up front." Mrs. Mitchell's eyes narrowed slightly, and Florence knew the woman had heard about the auction. Everyone in Bentonville would have heard by now. But instead of judgment, Mrs. Mitchell's face softened with sympathy. "Come inside, dear. You look exhausted." She turned to Ezra. "And you, mountain man, look like you need a proper meal. When was the last time you ate something that was not dried meat and hardtack?" "This morning," Ezra admitted, and Mrs. Mitchell made a disapproving sound. "Both of you inside. We will discuss arrangements over supper." The interior of the boarding house was warm and inviting, with polished wood floors and lace curtains in the windows. The smell of roasting chicken and fresh bread made Florence's stomach growl, reminding her that she had been too nervous to eat anything all day. Mrs. Mitchell led them to a dining room where several other boarders were already gathering for the evening meal, and she quickly set 2 extra places at the table. Over supper, Ezra explained the situation in quiet tones while the other boarders pretended not to listen. Mrs. Mitchell nodded along, asking occasional questions, and by the time the meal was finished, she had agreed to take Florence on not just as a boarder but as help around the house. "I have been needing another set of hands," she said. "My daughter moved to Little Rock last year, and I have been trying to manage everything myself. If you are willing to help with cooking, cleaning, and laundry, I can provide room and board plus a small wage. It is not much, but it is honest work." "I would be grateful for the opportunity," Florence said, relief flooding through her. "Thank you. No thanks needed. Every woman deserves a chance to make her own way." Mrs. Mitchell patted Florence's hand, then turned to Ezra. "You are a good man, Ezra Yancey. Not many would have done what you did today." Ezra shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to praise. "I did what needed doing. Still, it was good of you." Mrs. Mitchell stood and began clearing plates. "Florence, why do not you help me in the kitchen and we can discuss your duties?" "Ezra, you are welcome to stay the night. I have an extra room and it is too late for you to head back into the mountains today." "I appreciate that, madam." Florence followed Mrs. Mitchell into the kitchen, where the older woman set her to work washing dishes while she wrapped up the leftover food. "That man saved you from a terrible fate," Mrs. Mitchell said quietly. "Men who bid on women at those kinds of auctions rarely have good intentions." "I know." Florence scrubbed at a plate, her hands shaking slightly. "I still cannot believe he tore up the bill of sale. He could have kept me as property, done whatever he wanted." "Ezra Yancey is not that kind of man. I have known him for years, since he first came down from the mountains to trade. He is rough around the edges and more comfortable with animals than people, but he has a good heart." Mrs. Mitchell gave Florence a knowing look. "He does not talk much about his past, but I heard rumors about a sister. Seems those rumors were true. He told me about her, about what happened." "Then he trusts you, which is saying something. Ezra does not trust easily." Mrs. Mitchell handed Florence a towel to dry the clean dishes. "You have a safe place here, Florence. I want you to know that. Whatever happens, whatever you decide to do with your life, you have a home here for as long as you need it." The kindness was almost too much to bear, and Florence had to blink back tears for the second time that day. "Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell. I will work hard, I promise." "I know you will, dear." They finished the dishes in companionable silence, and then Mrs. Mitchell showed Florence to her room on the second floor. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the street. After months of uncertainty, after the horror of standing on that auction block, Florence finally had a space that was hers, where she could close the door and be safe. She changed into the nightgown Mrs. Mitchell had lent her and lay down on the bed, exhaustion crashing over her like a wave. But sleep did not come easily. Her mind kept replaying the day's events, kept seeing Ezra's pale blue eyes and the way he had torn up that bill of sale without hesitation. He had given up everything for her, a complete stranger, because he had not been able to save his sister. The weight of that sacrifice pressed down on her chest, and she wondered how she could ever repay such a debt. The next morning, Florence woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of voices downstairs. She dressed quickly in her worn clothes, made the bed, and hurried down to find Mrs. Mitchell already in the kitchen preparing breakfast for the boarders. Ezra sat at the table with a cup of coffee, looking slightly out of place in the tidy dining room with his buckskin clothes and wild hair. "Good morning," Florence said, and he nodded in acknowledgement. "Morning. I need to head out soon, get supplies, and start back to the mountains." Something twisted in Florence's chest at the thought of him leaving. He was the first person in longer than she could remember who had shown her genuine kindness, and the idea of him disappearing back into the wilderness made her feel suddenly alone despite Mrs. Mitchell's hospitality. "Will you come back?" she asked, then felt foolish for the question. Why would he come back? He had done his good deed and set her free. He had no reason to ever see her again. But Ezra met her eyes and said, "I come down to trade twice a year, usually in June and December. I will check on you then, make sure you are doing all right. You do not have to do that." "I know, but I want to." He finished his coffee and stood, his height and build making the dining room feel suddenly smaller. "Take care of yourself, Florence Hartley. You too, Ezra Yancey." He left a few minutes later, swinging up onto his horse and riding out of town without looking back. Florence watched from the window until he disappeared from sight, then turned to help Mrs. Mitchell with the morning chores. The days that followed settled into a routine: cooking, cleaning, washing laundry, helping tend the small garden behind the house. The work was hard but honest, and Mrs. Mitchell was a patient teacher who showed Florence how to make proper bread and how to get stubborn stains out of linens. The other boarders were mostly traveling salesmen and merchants passing through Bentonville, along with a schoolteacher named Miss Porter who had a permanent room. They treated Florence with polite respect, and slowly the shame of the auction began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of purpose and independence. She earned her small wage and saved every penny, determined to never again be in a position where someone else controlled her fate. But at night, when the house was quiet and she lay in her narrow bed, her thoughts drifted to Ezra. She wondered what he was doing in his mountain cabin, whether he was safe, whether he thought about her at all. She told herself it was foolish to dwell on a man she had known for barely a day, but something about him had left an impression she could not shake. Maybe it was the quiet strength in his voice, or the sadness in his eyes when he spoke of his sister, or the way he had given up everything without expecting anything in return. Whatever it was, Florence found herself counting the months until December when he would return to trade. Summer gave way to fall, and Bentonville transformed under the changing seasons. The leaves turned gold and red, and the air took on a crisp edge that hinted at the winter to come. Florence had been working at the boarding house for 5 months now, and she had settled into her new life with a comfort she had never expected. Mrs. Mitchell had become like a mother to her, and the boarding house felt more like home than the struggling farm where she had grown up ever had. It was a cold morning in early December when Ezra Yancey rode back into town, his horse laden with bundles of furs and his beard even thicker than before. Florence was sweeping the front porch when she saw him, and her heart gave an unexpected jump. She set the broom aside and waited as he dismounted, suddenly nervous in a way she did not fully understand. "Florence," he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he was pleased to see her. "You look well." "I am well. Mrs. Mitchell has been very good to me." Florence clasped her hands in front of her to keep from fidgeting. "How was your time in the mountains?" "Lonely, but productive." He gestured to the furs on his horse. "Good trapping season. I should get a fair price at the trading post. Will you stay for a meal, Mrs. Mitchell would be happy to see you." "I would like that." They went inside together, and Mrs. Mitchell greeted Ezra with genuine warmth, insisting he stay not just for a meal but for a few days to rest before heading back into the mountains. Ezra agreed, and over the next 3 days, he and Florence fell into an easy companionship. He helped with repairs around the boarding house, fixing a broken fence and replacing some loose boards on the porch, while Florence brought him coffee and sat with him during breaks, listening to his stories about life in the high country. He told her about tracking elk through deep snow, about watching eagles soar over pine forests, about the absolute silence of the mountains at night when the stars seemed close enough to touch. In turn, Florence told him about her work at the boarding house, about learning to bake proper pies, about the traveling salesman who had tried to court her until Mrs. Mitchell ran him off with a rolling pin. Ezra actually laughed at that, a deep rumbling sound that made Florence smile. On his last evening in town, they sat together on the front porch as the sun set, wrapped in coats against the winter chill. The street was quiet, most people inside where it was warm, and for a while they just sat in comfortable silence. "I have been thinking about you," Ezra said finally, his voice low. "Wondering how you were doing, if you were happy." Florence's breath caught. "I have been thinking about you too, worrying actually. The mountains must be dangerous in winter. They can be, but I know how to survive them." He turned to look at her, his pale blue eyes intense in the fading light. "Florence, I want to ask you something, but I do not want you to feel obligated. You do not owe me anything, and you should not feel like you do." "What is it? Would you consider coming to live in the mountains with me?" The words came out in a rush, as though he had been holding them back for months. "Not as property or as payment for what I did. As my wife, if you would have me. I know I am not much to look at, and I live a hard life far from civilization, but I would treat you with respect and care. You would never want for anything I could provide, and you would be free to leave any time you wanted. I cannot stop thinking about you. These past months, you have been in my head constantly, and I realize I want more than to just check on you twice a year. I want to build a life with you if you are willing." Florence's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She had dreamed of this in the quiet hours of the night, but had never dared believe it might actually happen. Ezra Yancey, the mountain man who had saved her and asked for nothing in return, wanted to marry her. Not because he owned her or felt entitled to her, but because he genuinely cared for her. "I would have to be honest with you," she said slowly. "I care for you, Ezra. More than I thought possible for someone I have known such a short time, but I have never lived in the mountains, never even been away from towns and farms. I do not know if I could handle that life. I would teach you everything you need to know, and it is not as isolated as you might think. There are other trappers and families scattered through the high country, and we would come down to trade twice a year. You would not be completely cut off from the world." Florence thought about her life at the boarding house, about the safety and comfort Mrs. Mitchell had provided. Then she thought about Ezra, about the way he looked at her like she was something precious, about the strength and gentleness in his calloused hands, about the life they could build together in the mountains. The choice should have been difficult, but somehow it was not. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you, Ezra Yancey." The smile that broke across his bearded face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. He reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "You will not regret this, Florence, I swear it. I know I will not." They were married 3 days later in the small church at the center of town, with Mrs. Mitchell and the pastor's wife as witnesses. Florence wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Mitchell had helped her make, and Ezra had gotten a haircut and trimmed his beard, though he still looked every inch the mountain man in his clean buckskin clothes. The ceremony was short and sweet, and when the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Ezra kissed her with a gentleness that made Florence's knees weak. Mrs. Mitchell cried happy tears and insisted on hosting a small celebration dinner at the boarding house, inviting several of the townspeople who had shown Florence kindness over the past months. It was a joyful evening filled with good food and laughter, and Florence felt surrounded by love in a way she never had before. Even the shadow of her father, still sitting in jail for his debts and bad decisions, could not dim her happiness. The next morning they prepared to leave for the mountains. Ezra had used some of his trading money to buy supplies: flour, salt, sugar, coffee, fabric for making clothes, and various other necessities that would be hard to obtain in the high country. He loaded everything onto his horse along with his remaining furs to trade at a post closer to his cabin, then helped Florence up onto the saddle. She wore practical traveling clothes that Mrs. Mitchell had given her, along with a warm coat lined with rabbit fur. "You come back and visit when you can," Mrs. Mitchell said, hugging Florence tightly. "And if mountain life does not suit you, you always have a home here." "Thank you for everything," Florence whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "You saved my life just as much as Ezra did." "Nonsense. You saved yourself by being willing to work hard and start over. I just gave you a place to do it." Mrs. Mitchell patted her cheek fondly. "Now go on. Your husband is waiting and you have a long journey ahead." Ezra swung up behind Florence, his arms coming around her to hold the reins, and they rode out of Bentonville as the winter sun climbed higher in the sky. The journey into the mountains took 4 days. following trails that grew progressively narrower and steeper as they climbed into the high country. Ezra was a patient teacher, pointing out landmarks and showing Florence how to read the forest, how to identify animal tracks in the snow, how to find water sources and safe places to camp. They spent their nights around a campfire, wrapped in blankets under the stars, talking about everything and nothing. Ezra told her more about his past, about growing up poor in Missouri and heading west after his sister's death, about learning to trap from an old mountain man who had taken pity on a grieving teenager. Florence told him about her childhood, about her mother's kindness and her father's slow descent into gambling and drink, about the farm that had never quite prospered no matter how hard they worked it. "I used to dream about leaving," she admitted on their third night, huddled close to Ezra for warmth. "About seeing new places and having a different life. I just never imagined it would happen like this. Are you having second thoughts?" His voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear the worry underneath. "No, I am exactly where I want to be." He tightened his arms around her, and they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the forest around them. Florence felt safe in a way she never had before, protected not just by Ezra's strength, but by the depth of his care for her. He had proven from the very beginning that he valued her freedom and happiness above everything else, and that knowledge gave her confidence in their future together. On the fourth day, they reached Ezra's cabin just as snow began to fall. It was a solid structure built of logs and tucked into a clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a small barn for the horse and a creek running nearby. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating Ezra had left the fire banked before heading down to trade, and the sight of that smoke against the white sky looked like the most welcoming thing Florence had ever seen. "Home," Ezra said simply, and helped her down from the horse. The interior of the cabin was one large room with a stone fireplace at one end, a sleeping area with a large bed covered in furs, a table and chairs for eating, and shelves lined with supplies and tools. It was rustic but well-maintained, and Florence could see evidence of Ezra's care in every detail. The sturdy furniture he had built himself, the neat organization of his belongings, the herbs hanging from the rafters to dry. "It is not much," Ezra said, suddenly sounding uncertain. "But it is warm and dry, and I can build more furniture if you need it. Maybe some shelves for your things or a proper dresser." "It is perfect," Florence said and meant it. This cabin represented a life free from the constraints and judgments of town society, a place where she and Ezra could build something entirely their own. They spent the next few weeks settling into married life together. Ezra taught Florence how to dress and preserve game meat, how to make soap from lye and animal fat, how to identify edible plants and prepare medicinal herbs. In turn, Florence brought her skills with cooking and sewing, making the cabin more comfortable with curtains for the windows and cushions for the chairs. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side during the day and lying together at night, learning each other's bodies with patient exploration and growing passion. Christmas came, and they celebrated alone in their mountain cabin, exchanging simple gifts. Ezra gave Florence a beautiful fur cloak he had spent weeks preparing and sewing, lined with the softest rabbit pelts and decorated with intricate beadwork he had learned from trading with native tribes. Florence gave him a new shirt she had sewn from fabric she had brought from town, fitting it to his broad shoulders with careful precision. They cooked a special meal of roasted venison and biscuits with wild berry preserves, and as they ate by candlelight, Florence felt more content than she ever had in her entire life. "I love you," she said, the words coming easily now after weeks of marriage. I know I should have said it before, but I wanted to be sure. I am sure now. I love you, Ezra." His eyes glistened in the firelight, and he reached across the table to take her hand. "I love you too, Florence. From the moment I saw you on that auction block, something in me knew you were meant to be mine. Not as property, but as a partner, as the other half of my heart." They made love that night with a tenderness that left Florence breathless, and she fell asleep wrapped in her husband's strong arms, listening to the wind howl outside while the fire kept them warm and safe. Winter deepened around their mountain cabin, bringing heavy snows that sometimes kept them inside for days at a time, but Florence never felt trapped. Instead, she felt liberated, free from the expectations and limitations that had defined her old life. The weeks turned into months, and Florence adapted to mountain life with surprising ease. She learned to shoot a rifle accurately enough to bring down small game, to read weather patterns in the clouds, to navigate through the forest without getting lost. Ezra was endlessly patient with her learning process, praising her successes and gently correcting her mistakes. They visited neighboring trappers and their families, and Florence made friends with the handful of other women living in the high country, strong, capable people, who had also chosen this difficult but rewarding life. Spring arrived with a rush of melting snow and wildflowers carpeting the meadows, and Florence discovered she was pregnant. She told Ezra one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, and the joy on his face made her heart swell. He immediately became even more protective than usual, insisting she rest more and take on fewer heavy chores, though Florence insisted she felt perfectly healthy and capable. "I want to take care of you," he said, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "You and our baby. This child is a gift I never thought I would have." "You will be a wonderful father," Florence assured him, covering his hand with hers. "Our child will be so lucky to have you." As summer approached, they made plans to travel down to Bentonville in June for Ezra's regular trading trip, and so Florence could see a doctor and visit Mrs. Mitchell. The journey down the mountain was slower than usual, with Ezra being extra cautious about the pace and the terrain, but Florence enjoyed seeing the changing landscape as they descended from the high country. She had been gone for 6 months, and she was curious to see how Bentonville had changed, if at all. Mrs. Mitchell cried with joy when she saw them, immediately noticing Florence's pregnancy and insisting they stay with her for at least a week. The older woman fussed over Florence like a mother hen, making sure she ate well and rested, while Ezra conducted his business trading furs and buying supplies. The town had not changed much, though there were a few new buildings and faces. Florence even saw her father once, released from jail but looking worn and old beyond his years. He saw her too, started to approach, then seemed to think better of it and turned away. Florence felt a pang of sadness but no desire to reach out. He had made his choices and she had made hers. The doctor pronounced both Florence and the baby healthy, predicting a birth sometime in early autumn. "Mountain life clearly agrees with you," he said with a smile. "I have seen women from town who do not look half as healthy during their pregnancies." They spent several pleasant days in Bentonville, dining with Mrs. Mitchell, shopping for baby supplies, and even attending a church social where they were greeted warmly by the townspeople who remembered Florence's story. The schoolteacher, Miss Porter, pulled Florence aside at one point and said quietly, "You look happy, truly happy. I am glad that man saw your worth and did something about it. He gave me my life back," Florence said, "and then he gave me a new one better than anything I could have imagined." When they returned to the mountains, laden with supplies and gifts from well-wishers, Florence felt like she was truly coming home. The cabin welcomed them back with its familiar smells of wood smoke and pine. and they settled back into their routine with the added excitement of preparing for the baby. Ezra built a beautiful cradle from smooth pine wood, carving intricate designs into the headboard of bears and eagles and mountain flowers. Florence sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands moving with practiced skill as her belly grew larger. Their son was born on a crisp September morning with the help of a neighboring trapper's wife who had experience with births. The labor was long and difficult, but when Florence finally held her baby boy in her arms, every moment of pain was forgotten. He was perfect, with a thick head of dark hair like his father and bright blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. "What should we name him?" Ezra asked, holding his son with such gentleness that Florence's heart melted all over again. "I was thinking Thomas after my mother's father. Thomas Yancey." "Thomas," Ezra repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Thomas Yancey, born in the mountains, free from the very first breath." They raised Thomas in the high country, teaching him the ways of the forest as he grew from infant to toddler to curious child. He took his first steps on the cabin floor, said his first words while watching his father chop wood, and learned to identify animal tracks before he was 3 years old. Florence continued to make the twice-yearly journey down to Bentonville with Ezra, sometimes staying for weeks at a time with Mrs. Mitchell, so Thomas could experience town life and socialize with other children. When Thomas was 3, Florence became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a daughter they named Emma after Ezra's lost sister. Ezra wept when Florence suggested the name, holding his newborn daughter close and whispering promises that she would grow up free and loved, that no one would ever treat her as less than the precious gift she was. Emma was a bright spark of energy from the beginning, bold and fearless, and she wrapped her father around her tiny finger from day one. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. The children grew strong and capable, learning to fish and hunt and trap, to read and write from the books Florence ordered from back east, to treat all people with respect and kindness. Ezra expanded the cabin, building an additional room for the children and a larger storage area for supplies. Florence maintained a garden during the warmer months, coaxing vegetables from the rocky soil, and she became known among the scattered mountain community as someone who could treat injuries and illnesses with herbal remedies. They visited Bentonville regularly, maintaining their connection to the outside world while always returning gladly to their mountain home. Mrs. Mitchell aged gracefully, eventually selling the boarding house and moving in with her daughter in Little Rock. But she always made time to see Florence and her family when they came to town. Florence's father passed away when Thomas was 5, and she attended the small funeral feeling a complex mix of grief and relief. She had long since forgiven him for what he had done, understanding that his demons had driven him to terrible choices. But she had never forgotten the lesson, that a person's worth was not tied to their possessions or their debts, but to the choices they made and the love they gave. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ezra and Florence stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching Thomas and Emma play in the clearing while the sun set behind the mountains. Florence leaned against her husband's solid warmth, his arm wrapped securely around her waist, and marveled at how far they had come from that terrible day in Bentonville when she had stood on an auction block with no hope for the future. "You ever regret it?" she asked, not for the first time. "Spending everything you had to buy my freedom?" "Never," Ezra said firmly. "That was the best money I ever spent. It brought me you and our children and this life we have built together. I would do it again 1,000 times over. I still cannot believe you tore up that bill of sale. You could have kept me as property." "I did not want property. I wanted a partner, an equal, someone to share this life with by choice, not obligation. He turned her to face him, his pale blue eyes as intense now as they had been that first day. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Florence Yancey. You and our children are my entire world." She kissed him then, pouring a decade of love and gratitude into that single moment, and when they pulled apart, both were smiling. Emma came running up to the porch demanding attention, and Thomas followed close behind with a frog he had caught near the creek, and they all went inside together to prepare supper as a family. Later, after the children were asleep in their beds, Florence and Ezra lay together in their own bed, watching the firelight dance across the ceiling and talking quietly about their plans for the future. "I want to add another room onto the cabin," Ezra said. "Thomas is getting too old to share with his sister, and Emma deserves her own space." "That is a good idea. We could also think about getting some chickens. Fresh eggs would be nice, and the children could help care for them." "Chickens," Ezra mused. "Never thought I would have chickens in the mountains, but I suppose stranger things have happened." Florence laughed softly. "Much stranger. Like a mountain man spending his entire fortune to free a woman he did not even know. Best decision I ever made." "The best decision we both made," Florence corrected. "I chose to trust you to marry you to build this life with you. That was my choice, freely given. And I am grateful for it every single day." He pulled her closer, and they fell asleep tangled together, safe and warm and loved. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, bringing changes both large and small. Thomas grew into a strong young man who loved the mountains as much as his father did, already talking about building his own cabin someday and starting a family of his own. Emma developed a passion for drawing, filling pages with sketches of the wildlife and landscapes around their home, and Florence hoped to someday take her to a city where she could study art properly. More children came. 2 more sons named Daniel and Matthew, spaced a few years apart, and the cabin rang with laughter and activity. The community of mountain families grew as well, as more people seeking freedom and a simpler life made their way into the high country. Ezra became a respected figure among them, known for his fairness, his skill as a trapper, and his willingness to help neighbors in need. Florence often hosted gatherings at their cabin, bringing people together for meals and celebrations, and she realized that she had found not just a home but a whole life beyond anything she had ever dreamed possible. When Thomas turned 18, he announced his intention to marry a young woman named Sarah, the daughter of a neighboring trapper family. Ezra and Florence gave their blessing gladly, helping to build a cabin for the young couple just a few miles away from their own. The wedding was held in a meadow carpeted with wildflowers, attended by all the mountain families and several friends from Bentonville who had made the journey up for the occasion. Florence cried tears of joy as she watched her son pledge his life to his chosen partner, and she thought of her own wedding a lifetime ago in that small church. How far they had all come since then. Emma eventually decided she wanted to study art in Little Rock, and though it broke Florence's heart to see her daughter leave the mountains, she supported the decision. They made arrangements for Emma to stay with Mrs. Mitchell's daughter and attend a school there, and Florence and Ezra visited as often as they could. Emma thrived in the city, her talent recognized and nurtured, but she always returned to the mountains for long visits, insisting that the high country was her true home no matter where her art took her. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows as all lives do. Mrs. Mitchell eventually passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, and Florence mourned the loss of the woman who had been like a mother to her. But the sadness was tempered by gratitude for all the years they had shared, all the love and support Mrs. Mitchell had provided. Daniel grew into a quiet, thoughtful young man who wanted to become a doctor, inspired by the healing work his mother did in the mountain community. Matthew showed an aptitude for building and carpentry, already helping his father with construction projects and talking about starting a business making furniture. Through it all, Florence and Ezra remained the solid foundation of their growing family, their love deepening and strengthening with each passing year. They worked side by side, faced challenges together, celebrated victories as a team. The attraction that had sparked between them that first day in Bentonville had grown into something profound and unshakable, a partnership built on mutual respect, trust, and genuine affection. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Ezra surprised Florence by taking her back down to Bentonville, just the two of them, for a second honeymoon of sorts. They stayed in the same boarding house where they had met, now run by Mrs. Mitchell's cousin, and walked the streets where their story had begun. The auction platform where Florence had once stood was long gone, torn down years ago, but the memory of that day remained vivid for both of them. "I was so scared," Florence admitted as they stood where the platform had been. "I thought my life was over, that I would be sold to someone cruel who would use me up and throw me away. And then a crazy mountain man spent everything he had and set you free," Ezra said with a rare grin. "The best crazy mountain man in the entire world." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Thank you, Ezra, for saving me, for loving me, for giving me a life beyond my wildest dreams. Thank you for choosing me, for trusting me, for building this life together. You made me whole again after years of just existing. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to be more than just a lonely trapper in the mountains." They renewed their wedding vows in the same church where they had first married, with the current pastor officiating and several old friends from town in attendance. Afterward, they visited the general store and bought peppermint sticks like young courting couples, then rode back up into the mountains holding hands, as much in love at 44 and 46 as they had been at 19 and 25. More grandchildren came as Thomas and Sarah had their own family, and eventually Daniel married a young teacher from Little Rock and settled in town to practice medicine. Matthew did indeed start a furniture business, though he based it in the mountains and only went to town to deliver his pieces and take orders. Emma married a fellow artist and split her time between Little Rock and the mountain cabin, always bringing her husband and eventual children to visit frequently. Florence and Ezra grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces weathering with age and hard work, but their love never diminishing. They still made the journey down to trade twice a year until they were well into their 60s, finally slowing down only when their joints protested too much against the long ride. But they never stopped working, never stopped enjoying each other's company, never stopped being grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together. On a warm summer evening when Florence was 67 and Ezra 69, they sat together on their porch as they had countless times before, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Their cabin had been expanded multiple times over the years, and now sprawled comfortably across the clearing, with a large vegetable garden, a chicken coop that had proven its worth, and a well-worn path to the creek where generations of their family had learned to fish. "I have been thinking about that day," Ezra said quietly. "The auction, the choice I made." "You think about it often," Florence said, because she knew him better than anyone. "I do. I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I had not been in town that day, if I had delayed my trading trip by even a week. Someone else would have bought you, and our lives would have been completely different. But you were there. You made the choice to save me, to give up everything you had worked for. That was not random chance, Ezra. That was you being the man you are, the man your sister would have been proud of. I like to think Emma is watching over us, seeing the family we built, knowing that her death was not entirely in vain, that something good came from all that pain. She is watching, Florence said with certainty, and she is proud. How could she not be? You saved not just me, but our children and our grandchildren. You broke a cycle of pain and created a legacy of love. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, then said, I would do it all again. Every hard winter, every struggle, every challenge, all of it, just to have these years with you. And I would choose you again, every single time. You gave me freedom, then you gave me love, and those two gifts changed everything. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Inside the cabin, they could hear Matthew working on a new rocking chair, the sound of his tools rhythmic and soothing. Tomorrow, Thomas would visit with his family, and they would have a big dinner with everyone talking and laughing, the cabin full of life and noise and love. But for now, it was just Florence and Ezra, the mountain man and the woman he had saved, grown old together in the life they had built from nothing but courage and kindness, and an unwavering commitment to each other. I love you, Florence said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she had spoken them. I love you too, Ezra replied, his voice steady and sure. Always have, always will. They went inside together as the stars brightened overhead, and Florence thought about the young woman who had stood on that auction block so many years ago, terrified and alone. She wished she could go back and tell that girl that everything would be all right, that a stranger would save her and she would find happiness beyond measure. But perhaps it was better this way, better to have lived through the fear and uncertainty, to fully appreciate the joy and security that followed. That night, as Florence drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, surrounded by the sounds of the mountain night and the warmth of their home, she felt at peace. She had lived a full life, loved deeply and been loved in return, raised children who would carry on their legacy of kindness and strength. She had been auctioned off to pay her father's debts, and a mountain man had bid everything he had and set her free. From that single act of compassion had grown a love story that spanned decades, a family that flourished in the high country, and a partnership that proved the very best of what two people could build together when they chose each other freely and completely. The years ahead would bring more changes, more challenges, but Florence and Ezra would face them together as they always had. Their story, which had begun in tragedy and desperation, had transformed into something beautiful and enduring. And when the time came for them to pass from this world, they would do so knowing they had lived well, loved fiercely, and left behind a legacy that would endure in the mountains they called home and in the hearts of the family they had created together. The mountain man who had given everything to save a stranger had gained a lifetime of love in return, and the woman who had been freed had found not just liberty but purpose, partnership, and a happiness that exceeded anything she could have imagined. Their love story would be told and retold by their descendants, a reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures come from the most unexpected places, that true freedom is found in choosing to give your heart to someone who values it above all else, and that a single act of courage and compassion can ripple outward through generations, creating waves of goodness in a world that desperately needs it. Florence and Ezra Yancey had lived that truth every day of their married life, and in doing so, they had proven that love, when freely given and freely received, can transform not just two lives but entire families and communities for generations to come.